The gloves. The first officer on scene didn't knock. He didn't call out. He didn't even step onto the porch like most cops would. Because the front door to Nancy Guthrie's house was already open, just barely, like someone had pulled it shut behind them but never bothered to latch it. And in the dead silence of that suburban street, that tiny gap felt louder than a scream. Inside, the air was wrong. Not stale. Not musty. Wrong. Like the house had been holding its breath. The officer stood at the threshold for one long second, hand on his radio, scanning the entryway. A family photo hung crooked on the wall. A small table near the door had a bowl of keys. One set was missing. Then he stepped inside. And that's when he saw the blood. Not a pool. Not a splatter. A thin smear across the hardwood floor, dragged in a shaky line, leading toward the hallway like a trail someone tried to hide but couldn't. The officer's voice came out low and tight when he finally spoke into the radio. "We need backup. Now." Because the thing about blood in a home like this, clean, middle class, normal, is that it doesn't belong there. It never belongs there. And it almost always means the person who left it didn't walk away on their own. Welcome back. If you're into real crime cases that twist darker the deeper you go, cases where one small clue can expose an entire hidden life, then you're in the right place. Hit like if you want more cases like this, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, and comment right now with one word, guilty or innocent. Because by the end of this story, you'll have to pick a side. Nancy Guthrie wasn't the kind of woman who vanished. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't impulsive. She wasn't the type to storm out in the middle of the night and disappear for days. She was routine. Nancy was the kind of person who paid bills early, who remembered birthdays, who kept her grocery list on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a tiny lighthouse. Neighbors described her as quiet but friendly. The kind of woman who smiled when you passed her on the sidewalk and asked how your kids were doing, even if she only met them once. She lived alone in a modest house set back from the road, the kind of place you'd expect to feel safe in. A porch light. A small garden. Curtains drawn at night. But on the evening she disappeared, something broke through that safety like a knife. The last confirmed sighting of Nancy Guthrie was ordinary. She had been seen earlier that day, shopping, running errands, moving through her life like normal. No signs of panic. No signs of fear. But later that night, something happened inside that house. Something violent enough to leave blood. Something calculated enough to leave almost nothing else. When investigators arrived, the first thing they noticed was what wasn't there. No overturned furniture. No shattered glass. No broken locks. No obvious signs of forced entry. The home looked like someone had walked in, and Nancy had let them. That detail alone changed everything. Because if Nancy knew her attacker, then this wasn't random. This was personal. And that meant the person responsible wasn't some shadowy stranger. They were someone who could still be out there, walking around freely, blending in. Someone who might even be watching the investigation unfold. The first sweep of the house turned up unsettling details. Nancy's purse was still inside. Her phone was missing. Her car was still parked in the driveway. And her bed had never been slept in. It was like she had been interrupted mid-life. Like someone had hit pause. But there was one detail that made detectives exchange a look they didn't like. The back door. It was locked. From the inside. Which meant if someone had taken Nancy out of the house, they didn't drag her through the back. They took her out the front. Through the neighborhood. Past other houses. Past streetlights. Past the quiet safety of suburbia. And somehow, nobody saw a thing. The case immediately became a pressure cooker. Local police were joined by county investigators. Search teams spread through the area. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters circled. Every minute mattered. Because in disappearances like this, the first 48 hours can be the difference between rescue and recovery. But as the days passed, the case started to develop a new kind of fear. Not the fear of a missing person. The fear of a predator who had planned this. A predator who had been careful. Too careful. And the more detectives dug into Nancy's life, the more they realized something else. Nancy's routine had been stable. But her relationships weren't. There were small fractures. Little cracks in the perfect surface. And those cracks were starting to look like entry points. Detectives began with the obvious. Family, friends, neighbors, anyone who had access. Anyone who might have been inside that house without forcing entry. They asked questions that made people uncomfortable. Who had keys? Who had been invited over recently? Who had argued with Nancy? Who had something to gain? But the answers were frustrating. Nobody had seen anything. Nobody had heard anything. And no one had any reason to believe Nancy was in danger. Until the investigators checked something that most criminals forget. The timeline. Nancy's last phone activity. Her last messages. Her last online logins. Her last purchases. Her last steps. And that's where the case took its first dark turn. Because Nancy's phone went silent at a very specific time. Not gradually. Not like the battery died. Not like she turned it off. It stopped like someone ripped it out of her hands. And that moment lined up perfectly with the estimated time the blood had been left on the floor. Meaning Nancy didn't disappear slowly. She was taken fast. Then came the second turn. A neighbor, someone who lived 2 houses down, finally spoke up. They hadn't called earlier because they didn't think it mattered. But now they couldn't sleep. They told detectives that late that night, somewhere around the time Nancy's phone went silent, they heard a car. Not speeding. Not screeching. Just moving. Slowly. Like someone trying not to draw attention. They didn't see the vehicle clearly. But they saw headlights. And they saw something else. A figure. Just for a second. A person standing near Nancy's front walkway. Then gone. At the time, it meant nothing. But now, it felt like a missing piece clicking into place. Search teams expanded outward. If Nancy had been taken out the front, the abductor had to move her somewhere. Maybe a nearby vehicle. Maybe a hidden spot. Maybe a place they knew well. Officers combed fields, ditches, wooded patches, drainage areas, anything within a radius that could hide evidence. And that's when investigators received the call that changed the entire case. A source close to the investigation later told CBS News what was found. A pair of black gloves. Not near the house. Not in the yard. Not even in the neighborhood. More than a mile away. Discarded. Abandoned. Left behind like trash. But detectives didn't see them as trash. They saw them as a message. Because gloves aren't random. Gloves mean someone didn't want to leave fingerprints. Gloves mean planning. Gloves mean a person who thought ahead. And gloves found that far from the house meant something even worse. The attacker didn't panic and flee. They traveled. They moved calmly. They had time. And they felt safe enough to throw evidence away when they were done. The gloves were bagged and tagged immediately. Investigators treated them like gold. Because if those gloves were connected, they could hold DNA. Fibers. Skin cells. Something. Anything. One microscopic mistake. One flake of human material. And suddenly, the case could shift from mystery to manhunt. But the deeper fear was this. What if the gloves weren't just worn by the attacker? What if Nancy had fought? What if she had grabbed them? What if her DNA was inside them? And what if that meant she had been alive when they were discarded? That night, detectives returned to Nancy Guthrie's home with a new intensity. They didn't just look for blood. They looked for movement. They measured drag marks. They examined door frames. They checked for scratches. They dusted everything again. And in the hallway, near where the blood smear ended, one investigator noticed something that had been overlooked. A tiny scuff on the baseboard. Barely visible. Like something hard had scraped against it. Like a shoe. Or worse. Like a body. And then came the discovery that made every detective in that house go silent. Because inside Nancy's coat closet, tucked behind hanging jackets, was a small space most people wouldn't notice. And in that space was something wrapped in a plastic grocery bag. At first, it looked like nothing. Just clutter. But when the detective pulled it out and opened it, they saw what was inside. A second pair of gloves. Different from the ones found a mile away. Cleaner. Newer. And placed there deliberately. Like someone had hidden them in a hurry. Or like someone had returned to the house after Nancy was gone. And wanted to leave something behind. Something that would confuse the investigation. Or send detectives in the wrong direction. Because now, the case wasn't just about a missing woman. It was about someone who was playing with the evidence. Someone who was thinking ahead. Someone who might have been closer to Nancy than anyone wanted to admit. And as investigators stood there staring at the gloves, one question hung in the air like a threat. Were they looking for Nancy? Or were they already too late? The person who came back. The gloves didn't just change the investigation. They changed the fear. Because now detectives weren't dealing with a messy, emotional crime. They were dealing with someone methodical. Someone who understood evidence, understood police procedure, and understood exactly how to confuse a case. 2 pairs of gloves. 2 different locations. 2 different conditions. And one terrifying implication. Whoever took Nancy Guthrie didn't just leave the scene, they returned. And that meant the killer, or abductor, wasn't running. They were watching. Before we go deeper, I want you to do something real quick. If you think the person who did this was someone Nancy knew, comment, inside job. If you think it was a stranger, comment, outside job. Because by the end of this video, you're going to realize the truth is way darker than both. The gloves from the coat closet were handled with surgical care. Detectives sealed them, photographed every angle, and sent them to the lab with an urgency usually reserved for homicide cases. Because this wasn't just about a missing woman anymore. This was about a suspect who understood one thing very clearly. If you control the evidence, you control the story. And whoever did this was trying to write their own story. Investigators immediately split into 2 teams. One focused on the gloves found a mile away, the ones tossed like trash. The other focused on the gloves hidden inside Nancy's closet, the ones placed like a secret. They didn't match. Different brand. Different material. Different wear. Which made the question unavoidable. Why would one person need 2 different pairs? Unless there were 2 people involved. That possibility hit the room like a cold wave. Because if this was teamwork, it meant planning. It meant coordination. And it meant Nancy wasn't taken by accident. She was targeted. The police brought in K9 units again, this time using the gloves as scent articles. Dogs tracked from Nancy's front walkway, down the sidewalk, and toward the main road. Then, suddenly, the scent cut off. Like the person, or the vehicle, had been waiting right there. A pickup. An SUV. A sedan. It could have been anything. But the scent ending that abruptly told investigators the truth. Nancy didn't walk away. She was moved. And whoever moved her had done it fast. The next step was obvious. Detectives began pulling surveillance footage. Not just from houses. From traffic lights. Gas stations. Convenience stores. Anything within a few miles. And that's where the case started to tighten like a noose. Because the footage didn't show a chaotic kidnapping. It showed something far more disturbing. A vehicle. Driving slow. Almost crawling. Passing Nancy's neighborhood more than once. Like it was searching for something. Or waiting for a signal. That vehicle became the first real lead. But detectives couldn't identify the plate. The angle was wrong. The image was grainy. And the driver's face was hidden behind darkness and windshield glare. Still, the vehicle was consistent. Same headlights. Same shape. Same timing. It appeared in 3 different camera feeds within the same hour. Which meant the person behind the wheel wasn't lost. They were circling. Now here's the part most people don't understand about real investigations. When police don't have a suspect, they start building a psychological profile. And Nancy's case started screaming one word. Control. The person who took her didn't smash windows. They didn't kick down doors. They didn't leave a trail of destruction. They entered like they belonged there. They moved like they had done this before. And they cleaned up like they expected detectives to show up. That level of control almost always points to one of 2 things. A person close to the victim, or a predator who's practiced. Detectives went back to Nancy's personal life with a microscope. And when they did, they uncovered something that made the room go quiet. Nancy had been planning something. Not a vacation. Not a party. Not a move. Something else. Something private. A decision. One that could have changed her entire life. And the people closest to her didn't all agree with it. At this point, let me ask you something. And I want you to actually answer in the comments. What do you think is the number one reason people kill? Jealousy? Money? Revenge? Secrets? Drop your answer below. Because in this case, it wasn't just one of those. It was a combination. And that combination is what made Nancy's disappearance feel like a slow-motion nightmare. Detectives interviewed Nancy's inner circle again. A close friend mentioned Nancy had seemed distracted recently. A little jumpy. A little more guarded. And when asked why, the friend hesitated. Then said something that made detectives lean in. Nancy had been receiving messages. Not threats. Not obvious ones. But messages that felt like pressure. Like someone was trying to steer her decisions. Like someone was watching her. And the scariest part? Nancy hadn't reported them. She had tried to handle it quietly. Like she thought it would go away. The police obtained Nancy's phone records. Not the content, just the numbers. And there it was. A number that appeared repeatedly in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Not daily. Not hourly. But consistently. Like a heartbeat. The calls were short. Sometimes less than a minute. Sometimes just long enough to say one sentence. And the number wasn't saved in Nancy's contacts. That detail mattered. Because it meant Nancy didn't want anyone seeing it. Or she didn't know who it was. Either way, it was a red flag. Detectives traced the number. It was a prepaid phone. A burner. No subscriber info. No billing address. No name. Just a device that existed for one purpose. To communicate without being traced. And that single detail escalated the case into something bigger. Because now they weren't dealing with a messy personal dispute. They were dealing with a person who came prepared. Then, just as investigators started closing in, something happened that made the case feel cursed. One of the detectives assigned to Nancy's case got a call late at night. A private number. When he answered, there was only breathing. Slow. Then a voice, low, controlled, spoke 3 words. "Stop looking here." And the line went dead. The detective reported it immediately. The department traced the call. But it was routed through a spoofing service. Untraceable. Which meant whoever made it understood technology too. They weren't just physically careful. They were digitally careful. And that kind of criminal doesn't panic. They plan. The gloves came back from the lab. And what they found inside them made every investigator feel sick. Not because it solved the case. But because it confirmed the worst fear. There was not just one profile. One partial. One strong. The strong profile didn't match Nancy. It belonged to a man. And it was already in the system. But not for murder. Not for kidnapping. For something else. Something that told detectives exactly what kind of person they were dealing with. A prior arrest. A prior charge. A history. A pattern. The name was redacted from the early reports, but inside the department, it spread fast. Because the suspect wasn't a stranger from another state. He was local. And worse? He had been questioned in a different case years earlier, another disappearance. A woman who had vanished and was never found. Back then, they couldn't prove anything. Now, Nancy's gloves had just dragged his name back into the light. Detectives prepared to bring him in. They wanted to move fast. They wanted to avoid tipping him off. But they were already too late. Because when officers arrived at his last known address, they found the front door wide open. Inside, the place was half empty. Closets cleared. Drawers open. A mattress on the floor with no sheets. Like someone had been living there temporarily. Like someone had been ready to leave at a moment's notice. Then an officer noticed something on the kitchen counter. A receipt. Fresh. From a gas station. Time-stamped only hours earlier. And written on it in shaky handwriting were 2 words that made everyone freeze. She's safe. Now let's be real. If you're watching this and you're thinking, there's no way this ends well, you're not alone. So here's your 3rd engagement check. If you think Nancy is still alive, comment alive. If you think this is already a recovery mission, comment gone. Because the next discovery will force you to change your mind. The department issued a BOLO. Statewide, then regional, then federal. They circulated the suspect's photo. They tracked his known associates. They pulled his vehicle history. They checked toll roads. They checked border crossings. They checked airports. But the suspect wasn't running like a desperate man. He was moving like someone with a plan. Like someone who had already decided what the ending would be. And then the case took a turn that nobody expected. A call came in from a woman in a nearby town. She worked at a laundromat. She told police she had seen something strange that morning. A man. Alone. Washing clothes. Not normal loads. Not everyday laundry. But a single bag of items. Dark clothing. Heavy fabric. And a pair of black gloves. He had stared at the machines like he was hypnotized. Like he was waiting for something. Or washing away something. And when she asked if he needed help, he looked at her and said something that still haunted her voice when she spoke to police. You ever try to wash guilt out of something? Then he left. Police arrived fast. They seized the machine. They collected residue. Fibers. Anything. But what shook them wasn't just the witness statement. It was what they found in the trash outside. A torn strip of duct tape. With a single long strand of hair stuck to it. And the hair was light brown. Nancy's hair color. The case was no longer theoretical. This wasn't just a missing person. This was a woman who had been restrained. A woman who had been moved. A woman whose abductor was actively trying to erase the trail. And that meant time was running. The key that ended everything. The lighthouse keychain didn't just confirm Nancy Guthrie was taken. It confirmed something far worse. Because that key didn't end up in the mud by accident. It wasn't dropped during a struggle. It wasn't lost in a chase. It was placed. Left behind like a breadcrumb. A message. And the message was simple. I was here. I did this. And I'm still ahead of you. Before we get into what happened next, do this one thing for me. If you've watched this far, you're officially part of the investigation now. Hit subscribe because I'm dropping more real cases like this every week, and you do not want to miss the next one. And comment this right now, find Nancy. Because what detectives discovered after that key was the moment this case stopped being a mystery and became a race to stop a killer. The key was sent to the lab immediately. But detectives didn't wait for the results. They didn't have time. The suspect's DNA had already come back in the system. The burner phone, the laundromat, the duct tape, the circling vehicle. The pattern was tightening. And now the lighthouse keychain, Nancy's keychain, was telling them one crucial thing. Nancy's belongings were being moved. Which meant Nancy had been moved too. And if she was still alive, she was running out of time. Police expanded the search zone around the wooded service road. They brought in drones. They brought in cadaver dogs. They brought in ground teams with flashlights and long poles, probing ditches, culverts, and swampy patches. And what they found within the first hour made hardened officers look away. A piece of fabric. Not just any fabric. A torn strip of a blouse. Light-colored. So, the kind Nancy had been seen wearing the day she vanished. And on the edge of it, stuck in the threads, was a small dark stain. Old blood. The air in the command tent changed. Nobody was talking about missing person anymore. Now it was a recovery zone. Now it was a crime scene. Now it was about finding Nancy before the suspect erased the last trace of her forever. Detectives focused on one question. Why would the suspect drop the keychain here? Why leave it so far from Nancy's home? And then one investigator said what everyone was thinking but nobody wanted to admit. This is where he wants us. Because criminals like this don't just run. They control. They steer. They pull police in one direction while they move in another. And suddenly, every officer on the case realized something terrifying. While they were searching the woods, the suspect could be anywhere. He could be miles away. He could be in another state. He could be watching the news. Smiling. Now let me ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments. Do you think killers like this enjoy the attention? Comment, yes, if you think he wanted to be caught. Comment, no, if you think he wanted to disappear forever. Because what happened next proved the answer was darker than both. That night, investigators finally got a break. A real break. The toll camera hit. A vehicle matching the one seen circling Nancy's neighborhood had crossed a toll road 2 days earlier. The plate still wasn't readable. But the make and model were consistent. And the direction it was heading made detectives feel sick. It wasn't heading out of state. It was heading deeper into the rural areas, toward abandoned roads, empty farmland, and long stretches of nothing. The kind of places where screams don't travel. The kind of places where people vanish. Police traced the route. Gas station cameras. Convenience store footage. And then, finally, they got what they needed. A clear image of the driver. Not perfect, but enough. A man in his late 30s to early 40s. Hard face. Flat eyes. The kind of eyes that don't ask for permission. And on his right hand, visible for a second as he reached for the door handle. Distinct. A symbol detectives recognized instantly. Because it matched the suspect in the system. The same man whose DNA was inside the gloves. The department moved fast. They got warrants. They polled his known associates. They tracked his old employment records. And one detail came back that made the case click into a terrifying new shape. The suspect had once worked for a property maintenance company. He had access to vacant homes, abandoned buildings, foreclosed properties. He had keys. He had codes. He had the kind of access that lets you hide a person in plain sight. Now here's your third engagement moment. If you think the suspect used an abandoned property to hide Nancy, comment vacant house. If you think he used a remote outdoor area, comment woods. Because the answer was worse. It was both. Investigators searched a list of vacant properties tied to the suspect's former job. Dozens. Then hundreds. But one stood out. A foreclosure on the edge of town. A small house with boarded windows. No neighbors nearby. A long gravel driveway. And one detail that made every detective tense. The property had been inspected recently. Not officially. Unofficially. Someone had been there. Fresh tire tracks. A cigarette butt. A footprint in the mud. Police staged the approach like it was a hostage rescue. Because by now, the case had crossed a line. Nancy could still be alive. And if she was alive, every second mattered. They moved in the early morning. Silent. Weapons drawn. Dogs ready. A drone overhead. The team crept up the driveway, gravel crunching under boots. And the house sat there like a dead thing. Still, waiting. They breached the front door. Inside, the smell hit them instantly. Not decay. Not death. Something else. A sour, chemical smell. Bleach. Too much bleach. The kind someone uses when they're trying to erase a crime scene. They swept the living room. Empty. They checked the kitchen. Empty. But then an officer called out from the hallway. Down here. A basement door. But heavy. Not the kind of lock you find on a normal home basement. This was reinforced. This was deliberate. This was built to keep something in. The bolt cutters snapped it open. The door swung. And the team rushed down the stairs. Flashlights slicing through darkness. And then, someone screamed. Not a detective. A woman. A weak, broken sound. A sound that came from the far corner of the basement. They found her. Nancy Guthrie. Alive. Barely. Her wrists raw. Her face bruised. Her eyes sunken. But she was alive. In that moment, the case should have ended. It should have been the relief. The rescue. The win. But real crime doesn't give you clean endings. Because on the wall behind Nancy, written in black marker, were 3 words. She came back. The detectives didn't understand at first. But Nancy did. Even in her condition, her eyes filled with terror when she saw the words. And she whispered something so faint the nearest detective had to lean in to hear it. He said I reminded him of her. That was the moment everyone realized this wasn't his first time. Nancy wasn't the first. She was a replacement. A substitute. A continuation. And the person he had taken years ago, the woman who disappeared and was never found, was suddenly back in the room like a ghost. Not supernatural. Not paranormal. Just the truth. A truth the suspect had carried for years. Nancy was rushed to the hospital. And as she stabilized, she gave detectives the missing piece. The reason she had been targeted. The reason she had been pressured. The reason she hadn't told anyone. Nancy had been preparing to expose something. Something connected to the suspect. A secret. Not just about him. About someone else too. Someone respected. Someone untouchable. Someone who had been quietly protecting him. Nancy had discovered financial records. Transactions. Payments. A small stream of money moving through shell accounts. Money that didn't make sense. Money that looked like hush money. And Nancy, being Nancy, didn't ignore it. She started asking questions. And the moment she started asking, she became a problem. The suspect took her the night she planned to meet someone with the information. He didn't break in. She opened the door. Because he didn't arrive as a stranger. He arrived as someone she recognized. Someone she trusted just enough. Until it was too late. Police launched the manhunt immediately. But the suspect was gone. Of course he was. Because the basement wasn't his final plan. It was his temporary holding spot. And when he realized police were closing in, he did what predators always do. He ran. Then came the twist that made this case explode across the country. A week after Nancy was found alive, investigators raided a storage unit tied to the suspect. Inside, they found boxes, trophies, belongings from women, IDs, jewelry, phones, and at the bottom of one box, wrapped in a plastic bag, another pair of black gloves. But these gloves weren't just gloves. Inside one finger was a small piece of paper, folded tight. A note. 3 words. The same handwriting as the basement wall. You're too late. The suspect was eventually caught 2 states away after a traffic stop. He didn't resist. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He sat there calmly, like he had been waiting. And when detectives asked him where the other missing woman was, he smiled. Just slightly. And said, "You already walked past her." That sentence haunted the investigation. Because even with Nancy alive, even with the suspect in custody, the case wasn't truly closed. Not really. Because if he was telling the truth, then the missing woman from years ago wasn't far away. She was close. Hidden in a place police had already searched. A place that blended into the world. A place nobody questioned. And that is where the story ends. Not with a clean victory, but with a chilling question that still hangs over the Nancy Guthrie case. How many times did investigators come close, without realizing it? If you want more real cases like this, cases that start as a disappearance and end as something much darker, hit like so the algorithm pushes this story further. And if you want the next case before everyone else, subscribe right now. One more thing. Comment below the most haunting part of this story for you. Because the comment section on this channel isn't just reaction. It's where we piece the truth together. And some of you are going to notice details other people missed.